So what I'd like to make connections to Tim's talk, to Martin's talk. I'll try and be brief. When war broke out then on the 4th of August 1914, as Martin told us, City were on the way back from their tour of South America. They landed at Liverpool, so they took a train then back to Exeter. There was a banquet organised for the team. That was cancelled. We don't hear much in the press about the South American tour. There's an interview, I think, with Michael McGahey. Charlie Pratt, who was in the photo with Billy Smith, was interviewed as well. The Supporters Club, which had been formed a few years earlier, and which really were responsible for the ground development, for putting a roof on the cowshed in the 1920s, and major developments. They had organised, every August they would organise a sports day at St James Park. That was cancelled. So that was the climate in terms of what the players got back to. There was no recognition of what they'd done on the tour, nothing. In terms of the ground, with the impact of war breaking out, there were a couple of practice games in August 1914, and money was raised for local war charities. Soon it became clear that the FA were not going to stop the professional leagues. So there were three professional leagues at the time. There was Division 1, Division 2 and the Southern League. These were the professional leagues. Exeter City were a decent Southern League team. And on the 4th of September, Southern League games began. Exeter City were playing West Ham United. On the following Monday, it became clear that the club were going to face a lot of criticism from certain sections of the press. The Devon and Exeter Gazette, for example, had a photo, half-page photo, of the Popular Terrace, which we know is where the cowshed was. And it showed men in khaki, and then people who weren't in khaki. And there was the caption under the photo: "More men are needed." And this is the kind of language that was used. This is addressed to the young lads who were not in khaki. You should be heartily ashamed, and you should keep this photo so that those who follow you know what you did during the Great War. That was what the club and, well, fans and the footballers, that is what they were facing in terms of a campaign in certain sections of the press. Rugby was an amateur game. Rugby stopped and players enlisted. Cricket was almost at the end of the season. The cricketers stopped as well. Horse racing continued, golf continued. So Exeter City, perhaps reluctantly, continued, and one season was played out, 1914-1915. I'd like to refer to a few notes here. So in terms of addressing the public, Secretary of the club, Sid Thomas, had a letter published in the press outlining, on behalf of his directors, outlining what the club were doing then during the war. And some of the things that were happening, the club had placed at the disposal of the local military authorities, at their disposal, the ground. So the ground was being used daily. There was drilling going on. There was practice in rifle shooting at the ground. There was a public meeting after games. At the game against West Ham, for example, at the end of the game, there was a meeting to encourage people to enlist in athletes' volunteer force. Okay? That was duly criticised by the Devon and Exeter Gazette, by a military officer, as not being enough. Men should not just volunteer for a force and then stay local. You should volunteer and you should go and fight abroad. And again, that was actually used against against the club. The chairman, Michael McGahey, was actually on a platform with that military officer and a local MP, and had to listen to that. And he too wrote to the local press, and in his capacity as a well-known local solicitor, and said, look, I think one thing, there could be a fund set up for men who are married, for example. I think what he was addressing as well the concerns of the players who were married. One of the players, Sammy Strettle, had a 1-year-old son. So the club, you could say, in a sense, were on the defensive, but again, they remained firmly in the Southern League. They were playing, so they continued the campaign. I'm going to refer to another game on the 23rd of November 1914. Millwall were the visitors. We're told in the press that local military personnel who'd been injured, brought back home, were invited as guests. One of these included a player called Sergeant Hyde, who played for the club in the 1907-08 season as an amateur. He'd been wounded. A bullet, very fortunate to survive in the neck. As Martin alluded to, George White, Sergeant George White, news of his death came. He died on the 30th of October 1914. And when news began to appear in the press that Exeter City player dies, I think then that people understood that certain sections of the club, the amateur players, there were board members who'd enlisted, were actually doing something for the war effort. So the impact of the war, certainly in those first few months, the club continued. The club was running a reserve team as well. On the 19th of December, Southampton played here. And to allude to Tim's talk, there was an officer from the Sportsman's Battalion. And the officer marched from the old grandstand across the pitch at half-time, addressed the cowshed. So the FA, Frederick Wall, the Secretary of the FA, and I think the Home Office, they did feel that football clubs could use games as a means of recruitment and for enlisting. But it did, in terms of numbers, the numbers didn't back this up, really. The Footballs Battalion was formed in, I think, December 1914. From the club then, the amateurs enlisted. There were 2 board members enlisted. And by the end of the year, Arthur Evans, who we've mentioned, enlisted in the Sportsman's Battalion. There was Fred Goodwin in the Sportsman's. And a few other players. But the season continued. So in April 1915, I think everybody maybe breathed a sigh of relief. There was to be no more professional football for the duration of the war. So Reading played a game here in April 1915. From that moment, the club continued to rent the land from the lady from the Clifford charity. They reduced it, the rent, to hardly anything, and the club left the premises to the athletes volunteer force. So they set up their HQ in the old grandstand. After that, by September 1915, we're told that of the 23 players on the books at the club, all of them had enlisted with the colours. So as soon as professional football stopped, then players, including married players as well, Sonny Strettle joined the Engineers, Rigby, the Transport Corps, and the club ceased to function. There were wartime competitions. The club could have joined one in the south. Southampton were involved in that, but they didn't. And there were charity games. So there was a game in the autumn of 1915. There was one in December. I think it was Boxing Day, December 1915. Fred Bailey, who we saw there, who was who was killed on the first day of the summer, 21 years old, from Heathershire. He played in that game, and so 6 months later, he was dead. The club during the war held AGMs for shareholders. And one of those in 1916, the news of Arthur Evans's death was announced by the board, and it was stated that a letter would be written to his parents. He was from Lancashire. As we approach the end of the war, games were being played by the men at Topsham Barracks, and so there'd be games between different regiments, notably. And when the armistice arrived, I think this shows the long tradition of St James Park as a place where community events take place. There was a children's night at Exeter, where 5,000 to 6,000 children paraded through the streets. It was a candlelit procession, and there was a big event with fireworks here at the football ground. That was in November 1918. And in 1919 then, in September, football resumed, the Southern League resumed. Exeter would play one season in the Southern League, and then they would enter the Football League in 1920. And we have that image, that very poignant image that Martin showed of Billy Smith with his former manager and his former teammates. There was the Supporters Club organised a collection for him. It was a game against Northampton in October-November 1919. Billy Smith came down from Lancashire, attended a packed Supporters Club meeting, and the presentation was made, and speeches made to him, speeches by the directors, by the Supporters Club members. I'd like to say a few words briefly about World War II. In contrast, the main difference, the main impact was as soon as war broke out on the 3rd of September 1939. It was the FA declared that there'd be no competitive football, no professional leagues, no professional league football would continue. The last game was on the Saturday before, where City had a reserve game. The first team were playing away, I think at Port Vale, maybe, and there was a reserve game against Hereford. So that was the last game before the end of the Second World War. It was announced that friendlies could be played in consultation with the local police. There were regional competitions. Plymouth Argyle signed up, Torquay United signed up, Exeter did not. The chairman at the time was Frederick Hunter, Captain Frederick Hunter. He'd fought in the First World War. He became an officer in the Home Guard, and he subsequently became Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Hunter. And I think as a Home Guard official, that would have been a factor in the club opting out of these regional competitions. The local football correspondent, just to give you an idea of people's reaction to that, felt that the club could have continued in a regional league, and kind of why is it that other teams, Plymouth and Torquay, are playing and we aren't? Hunter answered that in the press, and he said, one, with blackout times coming forward, and they would have blackout times would have affected the gates. So that was the first reason. Secondly, the ground had been commandeered by the Devon Regiment for an infantry training school, and that was, we're talking now, autumn 1939. There were games played here, apart from the training, the military training. These involved army teams. So you'd have an army team against Exmouth or Crediton School or something along those lines, but not two local amateur sides. So the ground was effectively off limits, apart from matches played by the military. Let me just, I'm coming to the end now. In 1941, one of the events of October 1941, again, I would have thought Hunter was behind that. There was a home guard tournament at the ground. We have pictures of this, where we see men in bayonet practice. We can see as well, yes, I think it is those photos, where we see the big bank is already beginning to look like what was described as a jungle after the war. We've got stories of people who can vouch for that. We've got this home guard tournament, 4,000 people. We've got pictures of the cowshed, a packed cowshed at this tournament. There were machine gun teams, route marches, these sorts of activities, and then of course 6 months later the Exeter Blitz, and so almost 300 people lost their lives, hundreds more were injured. The impact on the club, well, the chairman, Frederick Hunter, lost his life. When I look at the car park here, I think it's incredible, really, that the building at the back, the old school from the 19th century, is still standing. The school's still standing. So the incendiary bomb wiped out the church, and the church was really the landmark. The symbol of the ground, St James's Park, St James's Church, St James Road, St James's Station, the school as well. So the ground, the way it looked was just transformed. So not only the loss of life, also as we know, the major destruction to the city itself, we have there are reports of other players who died as well. Potter was an ARP warden, a former player, Albert Potter, and briefly then, after that, the ground was used for charity events. There was boxing here. There were sports days. There were friendlies here. There was a game in 1945 April. Plymouth Argyle came, and there was a friendly. 3,500 turned up. Again, the money went towards war charities. And the Americans used the ground. I haven't found any evidence that they're actually billeted here. So I don't go as far as to say that, but they were certainly present, and they would have trained here. And in January 1945, there was an American football game at the ground between two American forces teams. In August 1945, there was a baseball match at the ground. Again, we have a photo of the baseball. Anyway, just again briefly, when the ground, this I think was interesting. When the ground then began to become renovated and redeveloped, there is evidence that German prisoners of war were involved in the work that was done in getting the ground ready for football in September 1945, as well as volunteers. Clearly supporters were coming to the ground and they were saying, look, what can I do? Big bank, get the terraces in order, for example. So there was one season, there was a regionalised league in 1945-46, an interesting league where guest players could be introduced. I think that's the only time in City's history that they could include players from, well, Manchester United, for example. George Roughton, who then went on to become city manager after the war. He was one of the guest players. And so that leads to the club then, well, they lost their chairman. Sid Thomas became chairman in 1945. And in 1946 then, 6-7 was the first full Southern League Third Division South season after the war, and that's really what I have to say. So,
thank you very much.